Gary Gray went pale as it hit him. This dusty warplane buried beneath an alien world could shatter the fragile peace of the entire galaxy. Commander Gray of the Galactic Council fleet stared at the battered hull, eyes tracing the strange markings he now knew were from Earth, that primitive, quarantined world, the one strictly forbidden to all Council ships and personnel. Yet here it was, an impossible relic that shouldn't exist. Gary's mission had started as routine as they come, scan another lifeless rock at the edge of charted space. But an anomalous power signature beneath the ruins of an ancient city had drawn his ship down to investigate. His team had excavated the rubble to uncover this, the pristine wreckage of a craft that couldn't be. A warplane from a world that had barely achieved spaceflight when the Council ships first studied it centuries ago. Gary's fingers shook slightly as he accessed the flight logs. Each word only made the impossibility grow. This plane had been flown by a legendary hero in a terrible war fought on Earth long before the Council ever reached that sector. The fragmented records spoke of the pilot's skill, the advanced weapons that had turned the tide, and references to other ships like this one, hidden somewhere out in the void. As he struggled to process the enormous implications, Gary's blood ran cold at the sound of warning klaxons. In his attempts to power up the ancient systems, he had triggered a distress beacon, and it had been answered. A hydrogen warship, notorious for their raids on Council worlds, had picked up the signal and was burning hard for the planet, no doubt to seize this impossible technology for themselves. Gary's mind raced as he watched the Hydrogen drop ships punch through the atmosphere. Adrenaline surged through his veins. There was no time to evacuate this discovery, and no way he could allow it to fall into Hydrogen hands. This single craft could change everything, overturn the balance of power in the galaxy, and if the logs were true, lead the way to even more technology that could give its holder unrivaled dominance over all other races. Whatever happened next, Gary knew, could decide the course of history for centuries to come. With no time to spare, he steeled himself to defend this ancient secret. For the sake of the Council and peace in the galaxy, this cache of lost Earth warplanes had to be protected at all costs, no matter what he had to do or sacrifice. Gary's heart raced as the Hydrogen ships dropped through the clouds. Thrusters flared as they hit the atmosphere, kicking up clouds of ancient dust from the ruins below. "Commander, we have to get out of here," his lieutenant urged over the comms. "If they capture that plane—" "I know," Gary replied. He turned to his team, huddled in the shadows of the hangar. "Get back to the ship. Take the flight logs, guard them with your lives. I'll buy you some time." "But sir—" "That's an order, Lieutenant!" Gary barked. He watched his team reluctantly retreat towards the evac point. Then he turned back to the warplane, its metal hull gleaming in the alien sunlight. Gary's fingers flew over the unfamiliar controls as he strapped into the pilot's seat. Hydrogen boots pounded across the hangar floor, their guttural shouts echoing off the walls. He slammed the throttle forward. The engines roared to life. With a teeth-rattling jolt, the plane shot out of the hangar. Alien sunlight flooded the cockpit as Gary wrenched the stick hard to avoid a burst of plasma fire. Alarms blared as the shot scorched past, barely missing the fuselage. "All ships, the human is airborne," a harsh voice snarled over the comms. "Pursue and capture. I want that ship intact." Hydrogen fighters streaked after Gary as he climbed into the sky, their sleek ships quickly gaining on the bulkier warplane. He jinked and rolled, pushing the ancient craft to its limits to evade the incoming fire. Sweat poured down his face as he struggled with the controls, trying to outmaneuver ships far more advanced than anything he had ever flown. A flash of movement caught Gary's eye. His fingers brushed a strange lever, and suddenly the world outside the cockpit vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. The radar screen went blank. "A cloaking device," he muttered in disbelief. The warplane shuddered as more plasma shots flew past, the Hydrogen firing blindly in Gary's last known position. He banked hard, letting their momentum carry them past as he looped behind for a clear shot. "Commander Gray, come in!" a voice crackled over the comms. It was his crew, safely aboard their ship in orbit. I read you, Gary replied, his eyes locked on the Hirogen fighters. Sir, we intercepted a transmission from the Hirogen commander. They've been tracking someone called the Ghost of Saul. They think it's the same pilot from the plane's flight logs. Gary's blood ran cold. The legendary pilot who had flown this very craft. The one whose heroics spoke of other ships like it hidden somewhere in the void. If they find those planes... Gary didn't finish the thought. He couldn't. The balance of power in the galaxy would be overturned overnight. He stared out at the stars beyond the cockpit, an impossible idea forming in his mind. The flight logs had spoken of this craft's advanced capabilities, jump drives that could rip a hole through the very fabric of space-time. Commander, the Hirogen fighters are regrouping. They're coming back around. Gary's hands tightened on the controls. He had to warn the Council of this threat, had to find a way to safeguard the location of those planes before the Hirogen could reach them. The enemy ships streaked towards him, weapons blazing. Gary lined up the jump coordinates, praying the ancient system still worked. His finger hovered over the activation switch. "Forgive me," he whispered. Then he punched it. The stars outside the cockpit stretched into long lines. The Hirogen ships vanished in a blaze of light and color. Gary felt the crushing force slam him back into his seat as the warplane tore a hole in the universe and shot forward into the swirling vortex of hyperspace. Moments or eternities later, the plane shuddered back into real space. Gary groaned, every muscle screaming in protest as he checked the displays. Damaged, but functional. A small smile tugged at his lips as he recognized the star patterns outside. The Hirogen would still be circling that nameless planet, stunned and furious at his impossible escape. But he had no time to savor that small victory. Gary opened a channel to the nearest council world, his words spilling out in a rush. There were Hirogen out there searching for lost Earth warplanes, planes that could shatter the fragile peace of the galaxy. He had to reach the council, had to make them understand the enormity of this threat. As Gary's damaged ship limped towards the nearest friendly outpost, he could only hope he would be in time. Gary's hands shook as he guided the battered Earth warplane towards the council outpost. The ion drive sputtered and whined, pushing the craft to its limits. As he approached the landing pad, alarms blared across the facility. Security officers swarmed the area, weapons drawn. The landing gear creaked as it extended. Gary winced at the harsh scrape of metal on concrete as the plane touched down. Before he could even pop the canopy, a dozen officers surrounded him. "Exit the vehicle immediately," one shouted through a megaphone. "You are in possession of illegal technology." Gary raised his hands and slowly climbed out. Two burly officers grabbed his arms, slapping restraints on his wrists. They marched him into a stark interrogation room. For hours, they grilled him. Where did he get the plane? How did he fly it? What was he planning? Gary told them everything. The abandoned planet, the Hirogen attack, his desperate escape. "You expect us to believe this nonsense?" a stern-faced investigator growled. But as Gary described his encounter with Commander Indus, the mood in the room shifted. The officers exchanged worried glances. One whispered urgently into a communicator. Suddenly, the door burst open. A tall figure in ornate robes swept in, the Supreme Chancellor himself. "Commander Gray," he said gravely, "I need to know everything." Gary recounted his story again. He pulled up the flight logs, displaying them on a hollow screen. The Chancellor's eyes widened as he absorbed the information about Gunderson, Hawkins, and the secret Ghost Rider fleet. "By the stars," he breathed. "If the Hirogen get their hands on this technology, it would be catastrophic," Gary finished. The Chancellor nodded. "You've done well bringing this to our attention, Commander. But now we face a grave threat. We must locate these lost warplanes before our enemies do." He tapped a code into his wrist computer. "I'm promoting you to Task Force Leader, effective immediately. Your mission is to find Gunderson's factory and secure those planes." Gary blinked in surprise. "Sir, There's no time to waste," the Chancellor cut him off. "Assemble your team. We'll provide whatever resources you need." Over the next few hours, Gary pored over personnel files. He handpicked the best pilots and engineers from across Council space. Many were outcasts or misfits, but each possessed skills vital to the mission. As his new team gathered, Gary briefed them on the situation. He pulled up a holomap of the former United States. Based on the flight logs, we believe Gunderson's facility is somewhere in this region, he said, highlighting Utah. We'll start our search there. One of the pilots raised a hand. What about the Hirogen? They'll be searching too. Gary nodded grimly. That's why we need to move fast. Every second counts. As they prepared to depart, alarms blared across the outpost. Gary's wrist computer lit up with an urgent message. His blood ran cold as he read it. Commander Indus has been spotted in Earth's solar system, he announced. The race is on. Gary's team wasted no time once they reached Earth. They scoured the American Southwest, poring over ancient flight logs for any clues to the Ghost Rider facility's location. After days of fruitless searching, their sensors picked up faint energy signatures emanating from a desolate stretch of Utah desert. There, Gary pointed at the readout. Those emissions are too regular to be natural. Has to be some kind of power source. They touched down near a rocky outcropping, the scorching sun beating down on them as they searched for an entrance. It was Lieutenant Chen who found it, a barely visible seam in the rock face. Nice work, Gary nodded, running his hand along the weathered stone. Now how do we get in? As if in response, the rock face shuddered and began to slide apart, revealing a dark passage leading underground. Gary flicked on his flashlight and led the way in. The beam illuminated a massive underground hangar stretching into the darkness. Row after row of sleek aircraft stood silently, their metal hulls gleaming despite centuries of disuse. By the stars, breathed Chen. There must be hundreds of them. Gary approached the nearest plane, marveling at its pristine condition. As he ran a hand along the fuselage, status lights blinked to life in the cockpit. Incredible, he muttered. Some kind of automated maintenance system must have kept them operational all this time. But as Gary began powering up the first squadron, a sobering realization hit him. The ion trail from these power cores. It'll light us up like a beacon to anyone scanning the area. He clenched his fists, weighing the risks. Finally, he keyed his comm. All pilots to your stations. We're bringing these birds online. They'd barely gotten the first wave of Ghost Riders airborne when alarms blared throughout the facility. Gary's blood ran cold as he saw the massive Hirogen warship descending through the atmosphere. Indus, he snarled. All fighters, engage. Keep them away from the hangar entrance. The underground complex shook as plasma bolts rained down from above. Hirogen troops rappelled into the tunnels, exchanging fire with Gary's defenders. In the chaos, Gary stumbled across an old computer terminal. As enemy fire whizzed past his head, he frantically scrolled through the logs, his eyes widening in horror at what he found. A doomsday weapon, he whispered. Gunderson, what were you thinking? A massive explosion rocked the hangar. Gary looked up to see Indus himself leading a final push to seize the remaining Ghost Riders. With no time left, Gary made an impossible choice. He activated the weapon's charging sequence, praying he'd find a way to stop it before it was too late. Fall back, Indus roared as the facility began to shake itself apart. Back to the ship! Gary watched the Hirogen retreat, but there was no time to savor the victory. They had mere minutes before the doomsday device activated. Overload the main reactor, he ordered. It's our only chance to short out the weapon. His pilots worked frantically, pushing the power core past its limits. With seconds to spare, the reactor went critical. The resulting explosion collapsed the underground complex, burying the weapon deep underground. In the aftermath, Gary took stock of their losses. Over half the Ghost Riders were destroyed, along with most of the facility. But they'd survived. For now. As they evacuated the remaining planes to a secure location, Gary couldn't shake a gnawing dread. The doomsday weapon was still out there, still counting down. And he had no idea how to stop it.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.